Hi everyone, and welcome to our Mind and Body session of Varsity Sci. We have three great speakers lined up for you today, and Yising will introduce them all. So I will now pass on to Yising, who will introduce our first speaker.
Hi, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session. So, our first speaker is Alessa, who is an undergraduate student at Cambridge. She will be giving a persuasive talk about how we cannot study the mind without understanding the body first. And she will discuss links between brain disorders and other body dysfunctions in order to show that our brains and bodies are much more connected than we are led to believe. So without further ado, let's now welcome Alessa.
Hi, so I'm Alessa. I'm an undergraduate at the University of Cambridge studying psychological and behavioral sciences. And I'm also studying for the medical college admissions tests to get into medical school in North America. And so I believe that my position as a student, kind of straddling both of these fields, puts me in an ideal position to argue about the issues in the diagnostic criteria that I'm going to be studying in both of these fields that I've picked out so far. So I'm here for one reason and one reason only. And I want to convince you that the way we diagnose and get diagnosed with medical and psychological disorders and abnormalities is deeply flawed. And that's because the mind and the body are so deeply connected. So here's a breakdown of what I'm going to be talking about. I'll start off by giving my perspective on the current diagnostic criteria, a little bit of a brief overview. Then I'll look into why the diagnostic criteria needs to be put forward and needs to put forward the link between our brains and our bodies. Finally, right before concluding, I'm going to show you that if we were to exploit this mind-body connection further, we could drastically improve the treatments. And I'm going to discuss a little bit about how this is being implemented today. So you may be wondering, why do we need to change diagnostic criteria because of new knowledge on the mind and the body's connection? And that's precisely the question that this presentation aims to answer. Hopefully, after watching me talk for the next 15 minutes or so, you'll come up with a little bit more insight on the next big thing in clinical science. So the myth that I'm going to be busting today is the idea that the mind and the body are two separate entities which operate on their own and barely ever interact. Hopefully, by showing that the mind and the body are connected, I'll be able to convince you that today's diagnostic criteria is in need of reform in both medicine and psychiatry. First off, I want to give you my perspective of what the diagnostic criteria of today is. As a student, as previously mentioned, who's studying for both medical entrance exams and for psychological and behavioral sciences, I feel like I have a good grasp of what the criteria looks like. So in medicine and psychiatry alike, disorders are classified by symptoms. In order to be diagnosed with depression, for example, a person must be experiencing, over the course of 2 weeks, 5 or more symptoms, and at least one of the symptoms should be either the first one, feeling sad or having a depressed mood, or 2, loss of interest or pleasure in activities that the person once enjoyed. So I'm not going to read out all of the different symptoms of depression out loud, but here's how it's described in the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic manual for psychologists, a little bit of a Bible for for psychologists. It's literally like a checkbox. So if you've ticked X amount of boxes, then you have this disorder. Students studying medicine or psychiatry are taught about different body parts in isolation, as if it were some sort of machine or a rocket. For the medical college admissions test that I'm studying for, students are taught about each different body part in isolation. You have one chapter on the nervous system, one on the circulatory system, one on the renal system, another chapter on the immune system, and finally a chapter on the gastrointestinal system. This style of learning makes it seem like these parts of the body work in complete isolation from the brain. Sure, it's easier to compartmentalize and break down content into different categories to make learning easier for future physicians. But as a future physician myself, I'm concerned that this kind of learning is teaching us that the human body is a machine and that we must learn about each of the different parts. If I wanted to work with machines, I would have gone into engineering. The human body is so much more complex, and it's about time that this is reflected in the way that the topic is taught. So many people may imagine that the mind and the body is some sort of spaceship. The brain is the central control center, and the body is a spaceship completely controlled by the brain. I'm here to tell you that that's not entirely true. The body actually controls the mind as much, if not more, than the brain controls the body. A very well-known experiment, at least in psychology, really shows us this point. So, as you probably know from Tom and Jerry, mice tend to run away from cats because cats eat mice. I mean, that's common sense, right? Well, not according to this bacteria called Toxoplasma Gondii. So T. gondii for short, these guys are part of a group of behavior-modifying bacteria which can only reproduce in felids, such as cats. As the name suggests, when a rat gets infected by T. gondii, instead of avoiding cats, the bacteria modifies the rat's behavior and encourages it to actively seek out cats, essentially making the rats less scared of cats by activating the attraction pathway in the rat's amygdala. On the right, we can see the activation of a part of the limbic system responsible for sexual attraction when a normal rat is exposed to cat urine and a female rat, versus when an infected rat is exposed to cat urine and a female rat. Essentially, our little Jerry becomes sexually attracted to Tom. When the rat eventually gets eaten by a cat, the bacteria can reproduce. And that's pretty crazy already, but there's more. I did my high school at a French school. As a dog person, I thought it was kind of weird that many of my friends were cat people. Well, guess what I found? About 1 in 2 people in France are infected with Toxoplasma Gondii, as opposed to the low global rate of 30%, or approximately 1 in 3. Toxoplasma Gondii has also been shown to make people like cats more. Now, I'm not saying that you need to be infected by a bacteria in order to love cats. What I am saying is that if a teeny tiny little bacteria can control the rat's brain so much that it goes against millions of years of evolution by simply invading the rat's gut, and this same bacteria can alter human behavior if they find themselves in our gut, then surely the millions of bacteria in our gut, called the microbiome, is a sort of mini ecosystem of bacteria, viruses, and tiny microorganisms, can drastically control our behavior. And that's indeed the case. A modified gut flora is found in people with mental illnesses and disorders, including depression, schizophrenia, autism spectrum disorder, anxiety, and many, many more. Mental disorders have a physical basis then, a modified gut microbiome. So why only give treatments that deal with mental symptoms? Why isn't modified gut flora a symptom of depression? But a modified number of bacteria in the gut isn't the only physical link between psychological disorders and body function. Fun fact for you, the immune system of many people diagnosed with mental disorders is different from the immune system of neurotypicals, or people with no mental disorders. So we all know someone who's always stressed out. For many of my friends and family, that's me. I'm sure many fellow students can relate to having a state of constant stress. And I can tell you that I'm the first person to catch a cold in my family, and I constantly have a sniffly nose in winter. Experimentally, stress causes an inflammation. So it would make sense that if I'm constantly stressed, my immune system would be tired of constantly fighting inflammation and would therefore be less efficient. People with anxiety have a modified immune system. Yet it isn't just people with anxiety who struggle with common colds more often than their neurotypical counterparts. People with autism also have different levels of cytokines, which is an immune system cell in their blood than neurotypicals. People with major depression have an inflammation and an immune dysregulation as well. So does this mean that people with mental disorders are just more stressed out? Maybe. What it definitely means is that the immune system is linked to the mind. So far, We've seen that both the immune system and the gut flora are different in people with mental disorders, such as anxiety and depression. However, these biomarkers, which biomarker means physical manifestation of a mental illness, are never taken into account when someone gets a diagnosis. You won't see altered immune system or uncommon gut microbiome in the DSM-5. And you definitely won't see link to anxiety or depression or schizophrenia in a medical textbook describing gastrointestinal disorders. And we learn more about how closely, the mind and the body work together, hopefully the diagnostic criteria will change and we'll see these links in textbooks and diagnostic manuals. Are you still not convinced that we need to link psychology diagnostic books with physical diagnostic books? What about if I told you that using our physiology and our knowledge about the links between the body and the mind, we could drastically improve the way we treat physical disorders? For a while, there have been many pseudoscience therapies that incorporate nature at their core. You may have heard of Wim Hof or the Iceman breathing techniques, which cured people's anxiety and panic attacks, according to himself. If not, the basic principle of the supposed anti-anxiety technique is forced hyperventilation before jumping into dangerously cold ice water. Yeah, Wim Hof's the guy who jumped into glacier water and didn't get hypothermia. Besides that impressive feat, I can't even manage a cold shower in the morning. He may actually be onto something. In fact, cold water swimming is getting an increasing coverage in scientific literature for its therapeutic effects. A paper that especially struck me was on open water swimming and depression. It was on a case study of a patient with major depressive disorder. This patient went cold water swimming weekly, and at the end of the experiment, she felt so much better that she actually stopped her antidepressants. Perhaps it was the nature around her that helped her with her depression. But my point of view is that the self-control she exercised on herself to go outside in cold weather with major depression helped her feel that she had some sort of control over her life. It gave her a taste of what she's capable of. If cold water has such a profound effect on the mind, maybe we should incorporate it into our therapies. What if we could teach stressed out patients to control their bodies with their minds? What if this could improve the treatment? Though Wim Hof's glacier swimming may be just one case study and is not representative of the rest of humanity, it shows us the possibility of our minds. If we can harness the power of our minds in this way, we could coach patients to facilitate their healing by teaching their minds to help their bodies. Think about it. What are we always controlling for in our experiments? The placebo effect. By simply thinking that something works, it can actually work, somewhat. That's the power of the mind. Take a moment to process just how powerful that is. The placebo effect won't cure cancer or prevent heart attacks, but it can help alleviate pain and reduce the painkillers patients may need to take. And that's a concept at the core of birth doulas. So a birth doula is someone who supports a mother through the labor and birth of her child. Studies have shown that doulas are beneficial to both reducing the stress during labor and reducing the amount of painkillers the mother takes on average. In one review, people who received continuous support were more likely to have spontaneous vaginal births and less likely to have any pain medication, epidurals, negative feelings about childbirth, vacuum or forceps-assisted births, and cesareans. In addition, the births were by about 40 minutes. There's a smaller amount of evidence that a doula that supports the mother during labor can lower postpartum depression in mothers. That's a crazy thought, especially with an opioid crisis in the US. To conclude, there's a growing awareness of the fact that the mind and the body work more closely than we've ever thought possible. This awareness has started manifesting itself in new therapies. Once the taboos of mental health are resolved and people like you and me acknowledge and accept the links between the mind and the body, I believe that this will unblock the bottleneck for a huge flow of therapies and hopefully a revision of the diagnostic criteria. This presentation was to show you that the connection between the mind and the body is the next big thing in medicine and psychology. There's already been a massive growth in the field, and there's cause to believe that this is just the beginning. Expect to see new therapies spring up like mushrooms in the next few years. And don't forget this: if there's a psychological issue, there's almost always a physical issue behind it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessa, for your very well-crafted speech. I'm now taking questions from both YouTube and Zoom. So if you're on Zoom, feel free to ask your questions in person, post them on the chat, or send them to me privately. So perhaps first, I'm just quite curious personally, because you have covered a variety of different disorders and their links to the mind and the mind. Are you personally interested to do research in the future, and on which specific disorder, if you are interested?
Well, I'm actually really interested in autism spectrum disorders at the moment, particularly because there's such strong links with loads of different parts of body functions. For example, I mean, research recently popped up about links even between different fields in psychology, between autism and gender expression, for example. And I think it's a very interesting way to kind of dig deeper on different aspects of the human body. But I don't think I'm qualified enough to talk a lot about it yet. I hope to maybe talk more about autism spectrum disorders in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So one question from Zoom. How do you think the teaching of medicine could change to incorporate the issues covered in your talk?
Okay, thanks. That's a really great question. I think maybe if we were to incorporate, for example, in my textbooks, when I'm learning about, say, the gastrointestinal system, maybe linking it to other previous topics or incorporating aspects of one topic into another, kind of weaving in different topics together, would kind of show that the body's more connected than just explaining one topic and then another topic and then another topic, just because it's easier. I hope that answered the question. That's probably my #1 solution.
Thank you. Another question from Zoom as well. Are you aware of any specific examples of the mechanism by which a kind of bacteria can affect mental health?
What I suppose mechanism, they mean just how the bacteria has been able to infiltrate the brain. And I've done a little bit of research on a good book, if people want to read further, is the Mind-Gut Connection by, I think, E. Mayer. And it basically explains a little bit about how we have loads of microbes that actually constantly influence our behavior, that are constantly in our gut. And depending, for example, there's a, there's a neural pathway that's really strong called the vagus nerve. And bacteria send this is from my research so far. Bacteria send neurotransmitters and chemicals up through the vagus nerve up to the brain. And from there, it can actually influence the person's behavior. But I feel like that's more of a general response. If they wanted to read more about it, I would really suggest that Mind-Gut Connection book.
Thank you. So one more question from Zoom. So the person said, I heard that you have used the example of a bacteria, so bacteria in quotation marks, that makes infected rodents sexually attracted to the smell of cat urine.
Yeah.
I know of an organism, Toxoplasma Gondii, that does what you say, but this organism is a protozoan. Are we thinking about the same organism, or you mean a different one?
I believe Toxoplasma Gondii is a bacteria. It's the bacteria responsible for toxoplasmosis, I think, in human beings, as well. It's the same bacteria, but I could be mistaken and it could be the same.
Okay. All right. If there are any other questions, feel free to post any follow-up questions or comments. And if there are any more, I will relay them to you, perhaps after the second or the third talk, if you are happy to answer them.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
All right. So thank you so much again, Alessa, for your wonderful speech. I will now
can you all see my screen?
Yeah, we can.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. And yeah, so thanks for that introduction. And I'm presenting this as a topic of interest since I wrote a review on this earlier last year. And this presentation will be an overview of some of the content of that review. I'll talk about the evidence indicating the microbiome is important in anorexia nervosa, causes and effects of an altered microbiome that individuals might experience, and how this knowledge, really importantly, can inform treatment. So first of all, what characterizes anorexia nervosa? The DSM-5 criteria is listed, and individuals with anorexia typically have low BMI. Currently, it is a disease that has the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric disorder, high prevalence in adolescents, and relapse is really common, with only 50% of patients fully recovering. There's a current lack of effective treatment options, and there's no gold standard, especially for those over 18, which is why exploring the etiology and progression of anorexia nervosa is quite important. So the microbiome, well, where does the microbiome fit in? So the microbial composition of the gut affects metabolic function and weight restoration, and this has been really well documented in studies of diabetes and obesity, for example, so other metabolic conditions. Anorexia of biological origin might be related to an altered microbiome, either one that's depleted or abnormal as a result of the malnutrition that comes from people with anorexia starving themselves, or as a pre-existing condition that contributed to the disease process. So do changes to the microbiota precede anorexia onset, or do they come later? This is a question that currently can't be answered, but it's likely that the gut microbiota does both to some capacity. I should say that evidence is increasing on the causal role of an altered gut microbiome in inflammatory diseases like arthritis, IBD, obesity, diabetes, and psychiatric conditions like depression and anxiety. So it's definitely very relevant to anorexia. And mechanisms for that include like differences in energy harvest and extraction from food, hormonal changes, increased gut permeability that has immune effects, inflammation, and it can directly influence the brain and behavior via the gut-brain axis, which I'll discuss a bit more later on. So in this area, there are currently narrative reviews, loads of relevant experiments on mouse models and reported clinical cases, but currently, for a few reasons, there isn't enough data available for meaningful systematic reviews specifically in this area. So the gut microbiota and its interaction with anorexia nervosa. So the detail that you see is an experiment of in a mouse model specific to anorexia. I think it was an activity-based anorexia rodent model. And the mice here showed behavioral characteristics of anorexia relative to controls to much higher degrees. And the fact that psychiatric features are transferable is, well, via the fecal microbiota transplantation, is really important, as well as the observation that when patients gained weight, the number of microbial species increased, but this wasn't as high as in non-anorexic controls. And you can also, well, I guess I'll move on to the next slide actually. So this flowchart is a little detailed, but essentially most organisms, and microbes included, have preferences for their environments. So dietary differences in anorexic people you would think that they would alter microbial composition, which is shown that they do. So this slide shows changes to the gut environment in anorexia and that impact on microbial survival and the likely effects of specific changes seen in anorexic patients. The taxonomic differences mentioned in the column on the right are noted in multiple studies, Borgo et al. Being one that has combined these observations. As the quantity of specific microbes increases, they can initiate positive feedback loops, which further change food preferences to increase their own fitness, as you can see, like via secreting metabolites and fermenting available dietary nutrients and outcompeting other microbes. These changes might impact the regulation of appetite and satiety, the extraction of calories from food, and may affect the immune system, all of which are very relevant in anorexia. So first of all, regulating appetite and satiety normally happens via the gut-brain axis, which is a two-way communication pathway between the central nervous system and the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system covers the entire GI tract, so the gut-brain axis links the emotional and cognitive centers of the brain with intestinal functions in the ways you can see on the right. The mechanisms involved in the gut-brain axis that directly influence behavior they're not that well understood, but they seem to include vagal nerve signaling, immune cell migration to the brain, and antibody effects, and effects via cytokines and hormones that regulate hunger and satiety, like leptin and ghrelin, orexin. So recent evidence suggests that appetite might not only be regulated by the body's energy expenditure, but also by the energy needs from gut bacteria, which may be distinct from the host. For instance, the production of short-chain fatty acids as a result of polysaccharide fermentation by intestinal bacteria can directly act on enteroendocrine cells of the intestinal epithelium and activate the release of hormones contributing to the feeling of satiety. Like a couple of examples are peptide tyrosine and glucagon-like peptide 1. So other molecules produced by bacteria are mimetics, meaning they mimic host molecules. This is the case for the bacterial CLPB protein, which shares a structure with alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone, which is involved in appetite control. So CLPB is produced by intestinal bacteria, and it can directly activate neurons producing POMC, which is a precursor for alpha MSH. And that's just a good example of a bacteria-derived molecule linking the gut microbiota and hypothalamic circuits controlling appetite. So extraction of calories from food, the second important area. So it was found that compared with normal weight controls, overweight patients have an altered gut microbiome, which appears to extract more energy from the same amount of food. This is opposite in anorexic patients, where they really do appear to extract fewer calories from the same amount of food, if not more. So during recovery, anorexic patients often need to consume about 4,000 to 6,000 calories just to put on weight. And this is during an unexplained hypermetabolic state that patients experience early in recovery that really slows recovery and hinders their ability to move on and carry out the cognitive parts of recovery and maybe like psychotherapy that comes later on. A causal role of the microbiome was demonstrated when stool transplanted from obese mice into germ-free mice resulted in greater weight gain than stool from lean rodents, so FMT from obese mice transferred to germ-free mice resulted in a greater amount of weight gain independently of anything else. And this finding was confirmed in humans when stool was transferred from them before bariatric surgery versus after to germ-free mice, and weight gain in those mice was largely very, very different. So the immune consequences, the immune effects in anorexia are vast. There are many changes to the immune system. For example, patients with anorexia have been shown to have high levels of bacteria that thrive on eating the intestinal mucus layer, many of which could realistically disrupt the intestinal barrier, increasing gut permeability and possibly accounting for the increased risk of autoimmune disorders in anorexia nervosa. Patients with anorexia also have an increased proneness to autoimmune disease and vice versa. And anecdotally, anti-inflammatory medication has helped some anorexic patients recover. So, does the microbiome influence disease risk? Possibly. Reducing the number of microbes in the gut could increase the risk for eating disorders, as indicated by the retrospective study, where you can see the details on the slide. I won't read it out to you. And this might be because of antibiotics, for instance, clearing some bacteria, allowing others to grow and taking nutrients and so on, disrupted intestinal microbiota, or the infection itself, in this instance, could have unmasked a genetic risk for anorexia nervosa via epigenetic changes. And this is an important question, the next one. Could altering the microbiome improve treatment outcomes? So nutritional rehabilitation or refeeding is a very important part of treatment, because a higher BMI correlates to better outcomes after treatment and lowers the risk of depression and severe somatic consequences that patients can experience later on, like osteoporosis and infertility. Alpha diversity, which means the microbial richness, so the number of microbial species, increases with weight restoration, but remains relatively low when comparing it with patients without anorexia nervosa, those who've never had anorexia. So, changing a patient's gut microbiota via FMT, so fecal microbial transplantation, could help them put on weight and counteract the hypermetabolic state. Although there's no conclusive evidence regarding the benefits of systemically giving prebiotics or probiotics, so delivering bacteria itself or food for the bacteria in anorexia nervosa, including them in existing rehabilitation and nutrition protocol could provide benefits to the gut microbiota, so help the population recover in size and prevent gastrointestinal symptoms that are typically associated with anorexia, like pain and constipation. Looking to the future, FMT shouldn't replace other treatments, but when it's combined with the standard multimodality treatment patients are currently offered, such as, it includes a range of things from like family therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, the refeeding that they currently would receive, it could improve treatment outcomes where refeeding and those other things haven't led to recovery. A trial for this in patients with severe and enduring anorexia nervosa was granted ethical approval earlier this year and should be able to answer this question. The microbiome is currently a hot topic in so many areas, but there are limitations to current studies because of what we understand about the microbiome in its healthy state, as well as the state it is in patients with different conditions. It's hard to identify which specific factors are mainly responsible for the changes in microbial composition in anorexic patients, because we need to factor in the effects of comorbidities like mood and anxiety, for example, that could affect the amount of food somebody chooses to consume just on its own. So ideally, when doing any sorts of studies in this area, we want large, well-characterized samples and longitudinally collected data, ideally not just samples from the beginning and from the end of studies, but taken all across to determine microbial composition at different stages and outline whether there's a causal link or whether changes are more correlative. So the bigger picture, there's been a shift towards classing metabolic elements of anorexia as causal and fundamental parts of the disease rather than simply consequences of restricted eating due to psychiatric factors. This is really exciting because it's a new perspective on a condition where developments on the etiology of anorexia have been relatively static for quite a while. And a big development in this area is genome-wide association studies and the results of these, with large sample sizes that have shown an unexpected number of hits related to metabolic processes and conditions, and more so than similar studies with samples of patients with other psychiatric disorders like obsessive compulsive disorder or anxiety disorders. So increasing consideration for the metabolic component of anorexia and understanding the differences in microbiota will hopefully lead to more effective therapeutics and better outcomes for patients. These are some references, and thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. I'll just stop sharing the screen.
Thank you very much, Gayatri, for your talk. So yes, I'm again taking questions from both YouTube and Zoom. So there's one question on Zoom. How do researchers control for the genetic differences, for example, when using animal models to study the effects of microbiota?
Control for the genetic differences. I'm sorry, I don't quite understand the question.
So I guess this, the person is asking, how do you make sure that the animals that they use are genetically similar?
Oh, okay. So if you're looking at a rodent model or a mouse model, then you would have the same strain of mouse, and that would be a germ-free mouse. So essentially, in the experiments I've mentioned, there's no microbiota. And what they would normally do if you are looking at a sample between two different mouse strains, if you're looking at the microbiota, so the genes of the microbes rather than the genes of the host, they would do some kind of genetic sequencing, so PCR perhaps, on the sample from the human or the sample that they've taken from the mouse with a condition like anorexic or obese mouse, and of the control or the mouse that you're transplanting into, and then you can look at, you can compare, and you can measure differences.
Thank you. There's one more question on Zoom as well. Sorry. So could you give an example of how, could you elaborate on the composition of the microbiota in people who are more prone to having anorexia nervosa?
On the composition?
Yeah.
Okay, off the top of my head, I can't remember, but I'll see if I can find that on my slide. It has a few examples that have been documented in quite a few studies. One of the key things is the difference between firmicutes and bacteroidetes, but that's sort of debatable because overall between different studies, like different studies have different findings, and a lot of the sample sizes in this case are quite small. So at this point, it's hard to conclusively say that like anorexic patients have more of this particular bacterial strain or microbial species than this. And yeah, there are just quite a few differences. Like so many things can affect your internal microbiota, like your diet, lifestyle. So studies between countries. One of these mentioned actually in humans was compared a sample from Germany versus a sample from Japan and found sort of opposing results between two different kinds of bacteria, and that genuinely could just be due to dietary and lifestyle differences.
Thank you. One more question from Zoom. When planning FMT, do you think, sorry, there's another question which popped up. So when planning FMT, do you think that the interactions between patient genotype and microbiome may be a problem? i.e., could there be interactions that cause unexpected effects that make this therapy difficult to administer?
I think potentially. So with FMT, I guess it's sort of a risk-benefit ratio, as with most treatments. It's successful in treating infection with C. difficile and metabolic syndrome. So based on that, it's definitely safe for humans to have fecal microbial transplantation, but there could be some differences between the current host microbiota and what you're transplanting. But I think it's unlikely that that would cause severe harm, probably some gastrointestinal effects.
Thank you. So one more question from Zoom. Hi, I would like to ask if there were any studies that looked at whether microbiome of recovered patients is different in ones who relapsed and ones who did not. Could microbiome after treatment predict relapse risk?
That's a really interesting question, actually, and I myself haven't come across a study that's looked at that. But I think that would be a really good question, actually, to look at whether the microbial whether there are differences between relapse and non-relapse patients. Yeah, I think that would be good. But in general, I think there are some commonalities in that the alpha diversity is lower in relapsed and non-relapsed patients, and the population size is lower.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone who asked questions. So I think now we'll
again. Sorry for the technical difficulties earlier. My name is Anna. It's great to be here. So a little bit about myself to begin with. I'm a clinical research associate working in emergency and thrombosis medicine. I've collaborated with a number of researchers in Canada and at Cambridge, of course. And today I'm going to be going over a study that I did on pulmonary embolism, as the title suggests. And for those of you who already know what this is, you might be wondering what in the world this has got to do with psychology. So let's get into that. Before we dive in, this is just a brief overview of what I'll be covering. Sorry if this is repetitive, but I'm going to start off, of course, with a quick introduction on pulmonary embolism, or PE. Then we're going to take a look at the core problem of it all to see how PE ties in with mental health. We're then going to move on to the study itself, of course, how we collected the data and analyzed it. Then I'll finally be showing what we found from that data and what that means for clinicians and the general public moving forward. So let's jump in. So I think it's safe to assume that many of us have heard of strokes and heard of heart attacks, and they're quite frightening things, which I think is part of the reason why they're so well known. The idea of a potential blood clot flowing around your body and getting caught somewhere along the way can be quite a scary prospect, be it in the brain or in the heart. But what about the lungs? And that's exactly where pulmonary embolism comes in. So a PE is essentially a blockage in one of the arteries within the lungs. This means that a blood clot from elsewhere in the body, usually from the legs, travels up through the circulatory system, where it eventually finds itself stuck in the arteries of the lungs. And when that happens, some of the most common acute symptoms we see are sudden dyspnea or shortness of breath. We also see sharp chest pain, which can sometimes cause someone to suddenly collapse, and tachycardia or elevated heart rate, along with a few other symptoms. Though interesting, as scary as some of this sounds, we find that some PE patients experience no symptoms whatsoever. So it can present itself quite differently among different people. As for its prevalence, among a general population, its incidence is approximately 1 to 2 per 1,000 people, so it's not an incredibly common condition. Rate of mortality is also rather low, at less than 1%, and it certainly isn't a death sentence of any kind, so it is treatable and manageable through blood thinners or what's known as anticoagulation. But the big question is, why exactly is PE so important? Well, for starters, it's relatively unknown. And in fact, most of the people I interviewed for this study had never heard of it before they were diagnosed with it themselves. The other thing is that it can cause permanent lung tissue damage when the blockage remains in the arteries for too long without treatment. So it can be a serious and a life-threatening condition. And more notably, perhaps, is the fact that it is invisible. Unlike some more morbid conditions, PE can be a silent killer and can be quite difficult to diagnose quickly because its symptoms can be caused by a variety of other conditions. So in other words, the symptoms are not quite unique to PE alone. So with that being said, let's dig into the problem. As we've seen, although PE is very much treatable for most people, it can be rather traumatic to suddenly experience heavy breathing and chest pain while you're simply out and about walking your dog, for example, and not having a single clue what's causing it. So existing literature has shown that PE patients have reported feeling a loss of self along with a need to modify their lifestyles. And this is because anticoagulation, of course, comes with a risk of bleeding. So if you're out playing football and accidentally get kicked a little bit too hard, what would normally be a simple but painful bruise could come with greater complications if your blood thinners make it more difficult for your blood to clot. And this would also make bigger things like car accidents much more dangerous. So some feel the need to be extremely careful with their lifestyles and limiting the amount of sports or physical activities they engage in, which can lead to a feeling of a loss of self or identity. It should also come as no surprise then that studies have also shown that some feel like they're living in a constant state of alarm, especially having gone through a potentially life-threatening event with distressing symptoms. And in fact, there's actually a term that's been coined to describe this kind of hypervigilance or hyper-awareness, which is post-thrombotic panic syndrome. Essentially what this describes is when patients who've experienced PE before feel as though any symptom they experience afterwards, let's say chest pain or shortness of breath, suggests that they're having another PE. So it describes this kind of hyper-awareness of any cues that might suggest that they're going to have another potentially traumatic experience, which is not good, of course. But I think the most interesting thing the literature suggested was that some of these patients experienced intrusive thoughts and memories. And if that sounds familiar, it's probably because it is, and it's reminiscent of exactly what you're thinking. PE has been suggested to lead to symptoms that are suggestive of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And it's fascinating, I think, that what we typically associate with veterans or more commonly seen traumatic events might actually be linked to a blood clot that barely anyone's ever heard of. And so really, this was the basis for our study, and we wanted to see exactly how big of a problem this might be to determine if this was a problem that was going unnoticed or untreated in this patient population. And we also wanted to see it in a North American context because the few studies that I did see on this topic were largely based in Europe. And that brings us to our team. So it's quite a small team, but surprisingly interdisciplinary. So we have a physician taking care of the medical side of things, but we also have a sociologist taking care of the qualitative side of things and bringing a more nuanced perspective to the study. And then, of course, we have me. So this study was based in North America, as I mentioned, and more specifically Canada, at a thrombosis clinic situated within a hospital in a city with a population of about 600,000 people. And the study is a mixed methods one. So it has two parts. The first part covers the quantitative data. So we used a survey called the PTSD checklist for DSM-5 or PCL-5, which is rather self-explanatory, but essentially it borrows off of the definition of PTSD from the DSM-5. So this survey was our method of creating a kind of tentative diagnosis for PTSD. Then we have part two, which covers the qualitative side of things. And this was essentially in the form of semi-structured interviews to learn more about each patient's experience with their PE and hear their stories. And so overall, our aim was to combine these two parts to paint a better picture of the factors that might contribute to a PE patient's potential psychological distress and see if there might be a need for modifications or improvements to standard protocols by integrating mental health support into their course of treatment, for example. So this is the PCL-5 or the PTSD checklist that we integrated into our survey. And you can see some of the questions listed here suggest quite disturbing PTSD symptoms, like disturbing dreams, self-blame, trouble experiencing happiness, and angry outbursts, among other things. But all in all, you can probably see why it seems a little peculiar that a PE can be to blame for some of these symptoms. And it probably also raises the question of why other serious or life-threatening conditions may not have the same psychological effects on people. So what exactly did we find from our data? Let's take a look at some of the numbers to begin with. So over the course of 2 months where I was at the clinic recruiting patients for this study, we had 75 patients fill out the survey, with just over 62% of those being female. And when it came to the PCL5, 2 out of 75 patients were considered to have PTSD based on that scoring system. And it's not a significant proportion of our sample. And I guess that's a good surprise when it comes to what other studies seem to suggest about the prevalence of PTSD. But nevertheless, this is a problem that does exist with these patients. And part 2 of the study had fewer participants with 37 patients, which is actually still quite a lot compared to some of the other studies that had about 10 or 12 patients. Of course, it's a little bit harder to get patients to sit down and talk to you about their trauma for 30 minutes. But thankfully, I was able to meet some very friendly people who were willing to talk for up to 2 hours, actually. So plenty of data. And what I found was that 21 of these patients experienced some form of psychological distress as a result of their PE. And that's over 50% of our sample. So quite a significant portion. So let's dig into that a little bit more. Some of the key things we identified from the data was that the distress seemed to be associated with their distressing symptoms at the onset of their PE. So whether this was their chest feeling as though they were about to have a heart attack, or their shortness of breath leading to them fainting in the middle of the sidewalk, it seems reasonable that the experience would be connected with mental distress. However, on the flip side of that, we also had patients who hadn't experienced any symptoms at all. And in fact, this was typically the case for cancer patients. Reason being that cancer patients tend to be more prone to blood clots due to their chemotherapy. And so sometimes during a routine CT scan of the chest area, the radiologist would accidentally find a PE. So the patient actually never experienced any symptoms of their PE at all. And we can see that here in this quote from one of the interviews. So these are all pseudonyms, of course. So here we have Mr. Fitzwilliam, who happened to be one of those asymptomatic patients who had their PE accidentally found during a routine CT scan. And as you can see here, Mr. Fitzwilliam he only really saw his PE as a side issue that he's barely thought about, and especially when put in context with his cancer diagnosis, which was more important to him. Next, we have the fear of recurrence. So this was a big one, of course, because no one wants to go through the same traumatizing experience twice. And this also seemed to be something that stuck with patients for a really long time. And so we saw patients who experienced their PE almost 20 years ago, so the year 2000, and still had lasting anxiety about a potentially recurrent PE. And we can see that fear of recurrence here with Ms. Pembroke. So she says, it's something that's always on the back of your mind. I flew to South Africa, so it was a very long flight and I was on blood thinners, but still when I got there, I was extremely stressed that I was having another blood clot. I convinced myself that I was having one, but it was just in my head. So you can see that fear of recurrence here, and you can see some of the things I mentioned earlier about hypervigilance of certain physical symptoms, which in her case were symptoms that she thought suggested she was having another PE when she wasn't. Now, as doom and gloom as it all seems at the moment, not everything is so bad, because a lot of these patients also told me that their outlook on life became more positive. So for some, having been through such a traumatic or painful experience made them feel gratitude that they were still alive and got treatment and were able to sit down and have a conversation with me. Though maybe not the last bit, but essentially many of them took things less for granted and also used their experience as an opportunity to take more time to rest and relax. So here with Mr. Emmanuel, his doctor posed a rather ominous question in asking, is there anybody you'd like to call? As if it was going to be the last phone call he might ever make, which of course it wasn't. And his doctor also mentioned that a lot of people don't get through this, which made Mr. Emmanuel feel as though he was one of the lucky ones who made it out alive. But if the doctor's comments sound somewhat concerning to you in terms of the emotional response that elicited from Mr. Emmanuel, you're absolutely right in your concern, because apparently it seems that some doctors don't seem to be very good at giving PE diagnoses to their patients. And it seems to be more common with emergency physicians in particular, but there were quite a few cases where patients told me that their doctors told them they were a ticking time bomb or that they almost died today, putting great emphasis on the fact that they had nearly died. So it shouldn't be surprising that some patients experience lasting psychological distress or hypervigilance of their symptoms because their doctors framed it in such an alarming way. And in contrast, we found that calm and thorough deliveries of diagnoses were associated with lower levels of anxiety. And for me, I think these findings in particular was some of the most interesting because it suggests that the delivery of the PE diagnosis can be just as important as the PE itself in considering what factors influence a patient's mental well-being and their perceptions of their own condition. As for the treatment of these patients, we found that many were unwilling to stop their anticoagulants. So typically what happens is that patients would be put on short-term anticoagulation, and after their PE, it depends on the situation, but in many cases, patients can be taken off their anticoagulants after a few months or so. However, patients were often hesitant to be taken off their medication because they considered it to be life-saving. And they felt that it acted like a kind of safeguard that could prevent them from having another PE, when in fact it was no longer necessary for them to continue the medication. And the risk of bleeding with these anticoagulants would have outweighed any benefits it might have provided. So Ms. Newnham here is one particular example of a patient who's very hesitant to stop her anticoagulation. And she has a bit of an interesting story here. So she was in her kitchen one day and had her oven door open. So as she walked around, she accidentally scraped her leg on the oven door, which led to some minor bleeding. Now, the problem was that it bled and bled and bled for several days. And meanwhile, she kept taking her blood thinners. And as obvious as it might sound to stop blood thinners when you're bleeding, sometimes it just doesn't click that your blood thinners might be related to your ongoing bleeding. But it's not as though all common sense has gone out the window. And we can see that here in Ms. Newnham's explanation. So she says, you're so scared in case you miss a pill and your blood is going to clot. If you're told to take a pill at 6 o'clock every day, you're taking that pill. And so you can see that there's a great dependency on the medication to the point where it simply becomes routine and acts like a safety net. And lastly, and I think most importantly, our results show that 64% of our participants had not spoken to their doctors about their mental health. Now, granted, some may have been coping fine, and so obviously there would have been no need to discuss their feelings. But I think the thing that really stood out to me from the interviews was that patients seemed unable to not only explain how mental health services work, but were also unable to elaborate on their own feelings of psychological distress. And this was very clear to me when one patient told me he didn't need anyone to pat him on the back and tell him that he was going to be okay, which really shows this kind of lack of understanding. And perhaps this is the result of the stigma surrounding mental health, especially in an older population, or perhaps it has to do with the lack of exposure to mental health resources. But it's certainly a problem that I think needs some further digging into. So to wrap up our findings, we saw that distressing symptoms were associated with a fear of a PE happening again. We also saw how influential a clinician's delivery of a PE diagnosis can be in shaping patients' emotional responses and their perceptions of their condition. And we saw that, unfortunately, some people really weren't very familiar with mental health services and weren't particularly inclined to seek them out either. So what does this all mean moving forward? Let's start with clinicians. I think it should be evident by now that words can be incredibly powerful. And so caution should really be taken in how PE diagnoses or even other diagnoses are delivered. And it may also be wise for clinicians to consider that it is very much a possibility that their PE patient might be experiencing psychological distress. And so access to expert care and advice in that regard should be appropriately considered. As for us, the general public, I mean, the name of the session, Mind and Body, should be a pretty good indicator of the fact that our physical health is very much intertwined with our mental health, and as Alessa mentioned earlier. And I think generally the perception seems to be that things like anxiety or PTSD are independent of our bodily functioning. But I hope the connection between the mind and the body are much clearer now. Now, that being said, we might be inclined to suggest that integrating clinical intervention into PE treatment would be a reasonable next step. But I'd also argue that social support can be just as, if not more, practical. In fact, most of our interviewees suggested that speaking to family and friends about their PE and their struggles helped a great deal. And so it goes to show that there are many potential ways of dealing with something like this. And finally, education is absolutely essential in normalizing the feelings of mental distress that may come with a PE. We often see mental health support services offered for cancer patients in oncology departments, for example, but it could be argued that all conditions should come with these services. I remember speaking to this one patient who started crying, and she told me it was because she had always felt alone in her feelings of anxiety and depression. She'd never realized that there were others like her who had experienced PE who also felt the same way. And so being able to work on a study like this has truly been very eye-opening. And I am hopeful that the more often we discuss these things, the less often people might feel so alone. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening in, and I hope some of this has been interesting.
Thank you very much, Anna, for your talk. So once again, questions and answers. So there's one question from Zoom. So referring to the support networks at the end of the talk. How would you support such social support networks?
So one of the things that we tried to do was build a brochure. So we actually designed a brochure and we implemented that within the clinic where I was interviewing all these patients. Essentially, the brochure went through not just the physiology of their PE, but also the potential psychological effects of them. So sort of normalizing the fact that some of these patients might be experiencing anxiety, depression, or other psychological symptoms, and making sure that they know where those resources are and how to find them, or encouraging them to speak to their doctor about that.
Thank you. I personally have a question. Yeah, so how early did, or like when did people start having this awareness about this psychological distress of pulmonary embolism?
So I think it was about maybe 2016. There were a few studies actually published in the UK. Those were semi-structured interviews in which there were researchers who took, general data, and what they found was that a lot of these patients expressed a lot of fear. And so at the end of that paper, it was suggesting that these patients might be experiencing PTSD. And so that sort of lent into this project, which we started back in 2018, so about 2 years ago. And the data that I collected was May and June of 2018. So it's quite recent. And I think it's an ongoing topic. There seems to be more publications on it. There are some from the Netherlands. There are some from Germany. But I think this is pretty unique in that it's the first one that I've seen in a Canadian context. So it does show that it seems to be a generalizable problem.
Thank you. One question from Zoom. Do you think that healthcare professionals are currently amply equipped to deal with holistic issues? If not, how would you change medical education to accommodate this?
I think that's a fantastic question. So I think with medical school, there is very much an emphasis on physiology, as we probably know. The issue with that is, even when I was presenting at a medical conference, some of these findings, I had a physician ask me, so how do you expect me to deliver this diagnosis? Which was quite alarming to me, because I think there can be a way to sort of mediate that line between making sure that the patient understands the severity of their condition without scaring them to the point where they have lasting anxiety and the physician makes no note of it. So holistically, I think medical schools are starting to see improvements in that. At least in a Canadian context, I see that there's more emphasis on maybe situational judgment rather than pure academics, which could be helpful. But ultimately, I think it's sort of up to the physicians themselves to have that humanity in them to realize it's probably not good to call someone a ticking time bomb, and there are other ways to express that severity to them.
Thank you very much once again. So I think if there are no other questions, I will wrap up the session. So firstly, thank you, Alessa, for a very persuasive speech about how important it is to take care of our mental health and how they can actually severely affect our physical condition. To the second speech from Gayatri on the effects of the microbiome and the links with anorexia nervosa, and to our final speech from Anna about the psychological effects of pulmonary embolism. So thank you once again to all three speakers. And I personally think that at this, given the global situation right now, it's really important that we take more time to pay attention to our mental health, so that we could get through this situation as well as possible. So tomorrow will be our 4th day of the Varsity Sci Symposium. We'll be having talks on biochemistry, cell biology, and physics as well. And then we will have our keynote speech at 4 p.m. From Professor Jane Clark, who is a fellow of the Royal Society, and she is a professor of molecular biophysics. And she also does, she's also a biochemist as well. So hopefully we will see you again tomorrow and on Saturday as well, which is the last day of our symposium. Thank you, and have a good evening. Thank you.